The morning sun filtered through thin curtains as Akiko Yamamoto opened her eyes. Outside her window, Kyoto was already buzzing with life, but inside their small apartment, quiet still reigned. She could hear her mother preparing breakfast in the kitchen, the gentle clink of bowls and the sizzle of fish on the stove creating a familiar morning symphony. At 17, Akiko was like many other high school girls in Japan. She wore the same uniform as her classmates, carried the same style of backpack, and worried about the same upcoming exams. But there was something that set her apart, though few people knew it yet. Akiko. "Breakfast is ready," her mother called. Mrs. Yamamoto, a woman with kind eyes and hands that showed years of hard work, placed a modest but carefully prepared meal on their small dining table. Akiko's father had already left for work at the electronics company, where he spent most of his waking hours. "Did you sleep well?" her mother asked, noticing the dark circles under her daughter's eyes. "Yes," Akiko lied, not wanting to admit she'd stayed up late again, her fingers dancing in the air above her blanket, practicing the difficult passages of a Chopin nocturne she was learning. After breakfast, Akiko grabbed her backpack and the worn music folder she carried everywhere. "I'll be home late today," she said. "Piano practice." Her mother nodded, a small smile of pride crossing her face. Unlike many parents who pushed their children into music from toddlerhood, Mrs. Yamamoto had never imagined her daughter would become a pianist. They couldn't afford lessons when Akiko was young, and their tiny apartment had no space for even an upright piano. Akiko hurried to school, her mind already filled with music. As she walked, she hummed softly, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides. 8 years ago, when she was 9, she had never touched a piano. She'd never felt the smooth coolness of ivory keys or known the satisfaction of a perfectly played chord. That had all changed on a rainy Tuesday in 4th grade. "Class, we have something exciting to show you," her teacher had announced that day, leading them to the music room. There stood an old upright piano, its wood scratched in places but still dignified. It was donated by a local music shop that's closing down. While the other children pushed forward to look at the novelty, Akiko hung back, suddenly shy. Something about the piano made her heart beat faster. When the crowd of students thinned out, she approached it slowly, reaching out one small hand to touch a white key. The clear, perfect note that rang out seemed to vibrate inside her chest. "Would you like to try playing something?" the music teacher asked, noticing her fascination. Akiko shook her head, embarrassed, but the teacher sat down and played a simple melody. "This is Sakura," she explained. "Want to learn it?" That afternoon, instead of joining her friends in the playground, Akiko stayed in the music room. By the time the final bell rang, she could play the simple folk song with both hands. Something had clicked inside her, like finding a door to a room she never knew existed, but somehow recognized as home. For weeks after, she would ask permission to stay after school, practicing on the old piano until the janitors gently told her it was time to go home. She practiced the few songs the music teacher showed her over and over, then began picking out melodies she heard on the radio by ear. Mrs. Yamamoto noticed her daughter's new passion with a mixture of joy and worry. Joy because Akiko's face lit up when she talked about the piano. Worry because they couldn't afford to nurture this sudden talent. 3 months after Akiko first touched a piano, her mother surprised her one evening. In the corner of their living room stood a digital keyboard, not a full-size piano, but with weighted keys that felt similar. It wasn't new. Mrs. Yamamoto had found it secondhand and spent 2 months of her savings from her part-time job to afford it. "It's not much," she said, watching her daughter's face. Akiko's eyes filled with tears as she hugged her mother tightly. That night she played until her fingers ached, and her mother gently reminded her that neighbors needed to sleep. A local piano teacher, an elderly man named Mr. Tanaka, who had once played with the Kyoto Symphony, agreed to give Akiko lessons at a reduced rate after hearing her play. "She has something special," he told Mrs. Yamamoto. "Not technical perfection that comes with time, but she feels the music in a way that cannot be taught." By 12, Akiko had outgrown Mr. Tanaka's teaching. He connected her with a former student of his who taught at a music school across town. Akiko would take the bus there twice a week, her homework balanced on her lap as she traveled, determined not to let her grades slip despite her growing commitment to piano. Her father, though often absent due to his long work hours, supported her in his own quiet way. One night, Akiko found a CD on her pillow, Chopin's nocturnes performed by a famous pianist. She played the CD while doing homework, but by the third track she had put her pencil down, completely absorbed in the music. There was something about Chopin that called to her, the emotional depth, the singing melodies, the way happiness and sadness seemed to dance together in his pieces. The next day she asked her new teacher if she could learn a Chopin nocturne. "These are very advanced," her teacher warned. "Maybe in a few years," but Akiko was determined. She practiced the basic elements her teacher assigned during lessons, but at home she secretly worked on Chopin's nocturne in E-flat major, Op. 9, No. 2, one of his most famous works. She struggled with the ornaments and the flowing left-hand accompaniment, but something in the music pulled her forward. 3 months later she played it for her teacher, who sat in stunned silence when she finished. "Who helped you learn this?" he asked, knowing her family couldn't afford extra lessons. "No one," Akiko replied softly. "I listened to the CD my father gave me many times, and I found the sheet music at the library." From that point on, her teacher adjusted his approach, challenging her with more difficult pieces and focusing on refining her natural talent rather than following the standard progression. By 15, Akiko had won several small competitions in Kyoto. The prizes weren't large, a certificate, sometimes a small cash award that went toward her lessons, but each success fueled her passion. Still, she remained unknown outside of Kyoto's small classical music community. Her daily routine became a careful balance. School in the morning, homework on the bus, practice until dinner, more practice until bedtime. On weekends, she would practice 6 or 7 hours a day, stopping only when her mother insisted she rest her hands or spend time outdoors. Their apartment building manager, an older woman with a soft spot for Akiko, allowed her to use a vacant ground floor apartment for practice during reasonable hours. "Better acoustics than your living room," she said with a wink, though they all knew it was so she could play without disturbing neighbors. It was in this empty apartment, with its echoing wooden floors and bare walls, that Akiko truly found her voice as a pianist. Without the constraint of time limits or worried glances from her mother about noise complaints, she could explore the emotional landscape of the music she played. She would sit at the keyboard, close her eyes, and imagine herself somewhere else. A grand concert hall, perhaps, or a peaceful forest clearing with only the trees to hear her play. She poured everything into the music, her dreams, her frustrations about their financial struggles, her gratitude for her parents' sacrifices, her loneliness as a girl who spent more time with piano keys than with friends her own age. When she played Chopin, especially his nocturnes and ballads, something magical happened. People who heard her, her teacher, the apartment manager who sometimes listened from the hallway, even the few friends who occasionally came to hear her practice, would fall silent, captivated by the emotional depth she brought to the music. "How do you understand his music so well?" her teacher once asked after she played the ballad No. 1 in G minor. "Most pianists twice your age struggle to capture what you do naturally." Akiko couldn't explain it. When she played Chopin, it felt like having a conversation with someone who understood her completely, despite living in a different century and a different world. His music spoke of longing, of homesickness, of beauty tinged with sadness, all feelings she recognized in herself. As her 17th birthday approached, Akiko's playing had matured remarkably. Her technique, while not flawless, served the emotion of the music. Those who knew piano could spot the occasional smudged passage or imperfect ornament, but even they would admit that those small imperfections didn't matter when weighed against the soul she brought to each performance. What no one knew, not her teachers, not her parents, not even Akiko herself, and was that she stood on the threshold of a change that would take her far beyond the practice rooms of Kyoto. The gift she had discovered by chance at age 9 was about to carry her into a future she had never dared to imagine. But for now, on this ordinary morning, she was simply Akiko, a high school girl hurrying to class, with music in her head and dreams in her heart. Unaware that the world would soon know her name, Akiko's grandmother was turning 80 next week. She lived in a small coastal town 3 hours from Kyoto and hadn't been able to travel to hear her granddaughter play for nearly 2 years. Her health was failing, and though no one spoke of it directly, there was an unspoken understanding that this birthday might be her last. "I wish grandmother could hear me play," Akiko said one evening as she helped her mother wash dishes. She always loved when I played Chopin. Mrs. Yamamoto dried her hands on a kitchen towel and looked thoughtfully at her daughter. Why don't we record something for her? We could send it with her birthday gift. The next day, they cleared the small living room as best they could. Akiko's father moved the digital keyboard to face the best light from the window. The space was cramped. Laundry hung in the background, and they couldn't fully hide the stack of textbooks and papers in the corner. But it would have to do. What will you play? Her mother asked, holding up her smartphone to record. Akiko thought for a moment. Grandmother always loved the Ballade No. 1 in G minor. She said it tells a complete story without any words. It was one of the most challenging pieces in Akiko's repertoire, a work that professional pianists approached with respect. Nearly 9 minutes long, it demanded technical skill, emotional range, and physical stamina. But more than that, it required the pianist to become a storyteller. Are you sure? It's so difficult, her mother said. Akiko nodded. It's her favorite. I want to play something special for her. She adjusted her simple chair, closed her eyes for a moment to center herself, and nodded to her mother to begin recording. The opening notes floated in the air, questioning, hesitant, like the beginning of a folk tale told in the gathering darkness. Then came the main theme, tender yet carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. As Akiko played, she forgot about the cramped apartment, the hanging laundry, the phone recording her. In her mind, she was playing for her grandmother, imagining the older woman's face lighting up with each familiar passage. When she reached the thunderous final section, her fingers flying across the keys in torrents of notes, the small keyboard stand wobbled slightly, but Akiko was too deep in the music to notice. The final chords resonated in the tiny room, and for a moment, both Akiko and her mother were silent. That was beautiful, Mrs. Yamamoto finally said, stopping the recording. Grandmother will love it. They sent the video file to Akiko's cousin Haruki, who would visit their grandmother on her birthday. He was a university student in Tokyo who knew how to create a proper video DVD that would play on their grandmother's old television set. What Akiko didn't know was that Haruki was also an active member of an online classical music forum. 3 days after the birthday, while his grandmother was still talking about how moved she had been by Akiko's playing, Haruki made a decision that would change his cousin's life. Listen to my cousin playing Chopin, he posted, uploading the video to the forum. She's 17 and has never had a professional teacher. This wasn't strictly true. Akiko had teachers, though not from prestigious conservatories. But Haruki's pride in his cousin led to a bit of exaggeration. She taught herself to play Chopin by listening to recordings, he added. The video showed Akiko in her family's modest apartment, wearing a simple blue sweater, her hair tied back in a practical ponytail. The contrast between the humble setting and the magnificent music caught the attention of forum members. Is this for real? Commented one user. I've never heard such natural phrasing from someone so young. The technique isn't perfect, but listen to how she builds the narrative of the piece, wrote another. Professional pianists spend decades trying to achieve this kind of storytelling. The video began to spread beyond the forum. A piano teacher in Osaka shared it with her colleagues. A music blogger in Tokyo featured it in a post about undiscovered talent. Within a week, the recording that was meant only for Akiko's grandmother had been viewed by thousands of people across Japan and beyond. Akiko knew none of this. She continued her daily routine: school, practice, homework, sleep. It was her mother who first realized something unusual was happening. Akiko, she called from the living room one evening, have you been sharing your playing online? No, Akiko replied, looking up from her textbook. Why? Mrs. Yamamoto held up her phone. Your grandmother just called. She said her neighbor's son saw you playing piano on the internet. How is that possible? After a confused phone call to Haruki, who admitted what he had done with a mixture of pride and apology, Akiko sat in stunned silence. People are watching me play? Strangers? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Music had always been personal for her, a private conversation between herself and the composer, or a gift shared with family and friends. The thought of unknown eyes watching her play in their modest apartment made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. They're saying such nice things, Haruki insisted over the phone. You should read the comments. But Akiko couldn't bring herself to look. That night she lay awake, imagining critical eyes judging her playing, her appearance, her family's small apartment. 2 days later, the phone call came that would change everything. Mr. Nakamura, The director of the prestigious Tokyo piano competition had seen Akiko's video. "I've never called a contestant directly before," he told Mrs. Yamamoto, "but we have an unusual situation. One of our finalists has withdrawn due to injury, and we need to fill the spot. I believe your daughter would be an excellent addition to our competition." Mrs. Yamamoto's hand trembled as she held the phone. The Tokyo piano competition was nationally televised, with winners often going on to international careers. "But the competition is in 3 weeks," she said. "Is that enough time to prepare? From what I've seen, your daughter already has the musical understanding needed." "The technical details can be polished in 3 weeks," Mr. Nakamura said. "Will she accept the invitation?" That evening, the Yamamoto family held a rare council. Akiko's father had even come home early from work when he heard the news. "This is a remarkable opportunity," he said quietly, "but the decision must be Akiko's." Akiko twisted her hands in her lap. "I'm not ready for a competition like that. The other contestants will be from music schools, with professional teachers and years of proper training." "That's true," her mother acknowledged, "but Mr. Nakamura has heard you play. He believes in your ability. Can we afford it?" Akiko asked the question that hung in the air. "The travel to Tokyo, the hotel." Her parents exchanged glances. "Your mother has a college friend in Tokyo," her father said. "She's offered to let you stay with her family. As for the rest, we'll manage." What he didn't say was that he would work overtime for months to pay for the train tickets and new clothes Akiko would need. Or that her mother had already called her old workplace asking to pick up extra shifts. Later that night, Akiko sat at her keyboard in the darkness, her fingers resting lightly on the keys without pressing them. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant sounds of the city filtering through the window. The competition would require 3 different pieces, all Chopin. Since this year's competition had a focus on the Polish composer, she already had the ballade prepared. She would need to polish her nocturne in B-flat minor and learn the Piano Concerto No. 1 for the final round, if she even made it that far. 3 weeks was barely enough time to memorize the concerto, let alone perfect it. "Are you sure about this?" her mother asked softly from the doorway. Akiko took a deep breath. "No," she admitted. "I'm terrified, but I think I'll regret it forever if I don't try." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur. Akiko's school granted her a special absence, though her homeroom teacher looked skeptical when told the reason. "The Tokyo piano competition? That's for professional students." Her piano teacher canceled all other lessons to focus exclusively on preparing Akiko. "We're not aiming to win," he told her frankly. "The goal is to play well enough that you aren't embarrassed." Akiko practiced until her fingers cramped and her back ached from sitting at the keyboard. She listened to recordings of the concerto during lunch breaks and on the bus. She fell asleep with the sheet music on her bed and woke with melodies already playing in her head. 2 days before the competition, a package arrived. Inside was a navy blue dress, simple but elegant. "I can't accept this," Akiko said, looking at the price tag her mother had forgotten to remove. "It's too expensive." "You need to look the part," her mother said firmly, though Akiko noticed she was using the old sewing machine that night to mend their father's work shirts instead of buying new ones. The night before they left for Tokyo, Akiko couldn't sleep. She stood by the window looking out at the Kyoto lights, wondering how she, an ordinary girl from an ordinary family, had suddenly found herself heading to a national competition. Her hands trembled slightly and she pressed them against the cool glass to steady them. "What if I fail?" she whispered to herself. Behind her, the door slid open quietly. Her father, usually so busy and distant, stood there in his worn houseclothes. "Your grandmother called," he said. "She'll be watching the competition on television. She said to tell you she's already proud, no matter what happens." He hesitated, then added, "We all are." As the bullet train sped toward Tokyo the next morning, Akiko watched the landscape blur outside the window. Her music folder was clutched tightly in her hands, containing the pieces that might change her future, or lead to public humiliation. Either way, there was no turning back now. Tokyo was a different world. Akiko had visited the capital once before on a school trip, but arriving as a competition participant felt entirely different. The city's enormity pressed in on her as she followed her mother out of Tokyo Station, clutching both her suitcase and her precious music folder. There she is, called a cheerful voice. Mrs. Tanaka, her mother's college friend, waved energetically from the crowd. She was a plump, smiling woman who immediately enveloped Mrs. Yamamoto in a hug. "And this must be the pianist," she said, turning to Akiko with warm eyes. "My husband couldn't believe it when I told him you're staying with us. He's been watching your video over and over." Akiko blushed, still uncomfortable with the idea of strangers watching her play. The Tanakas lived in a comfortable apartment in a quieter part of Tokyo. While not luxurious, it felt spacious compared to the Yamamoto's Kyoto home. Most importantly, they had an upright piano. "It's old," Mrs. Tanaka apologized. "But my daughter used to play before she moved to Australia. You're welcome to practice whenever you need." That evening, after a home-cooked meal that Mrs. Tanaka insisted they needed after their journey, Akiko sat at the piano. It was indeed old, with slightly yellowed keys and a few scratches on its wooden case. But the tone was warm and the action responsive, much better than her digital keyboard at home. She played a few notes tentatively, then began the opening of the nocturne in B-flat minor. The rich sound filled the apartment and she lost herself in the music until she noticed Mr. Tanaka standing in the doorway, listening with closed eyes. "Sorry," she said, stopping abruptly. "Is it too late to play?" No, he said quickly. "Please continue. It's been so long since this piano had someone worthy of it." The next morning, Akiko and her mother took the subway to Suntory Hall, where the competition would take place. As they approached the imposing glass and concrete building, Akiko's steps slowed. "I don't belong here," she whispered. Her mother squeezed her hand. "Neither of us does. But we're here anyway." Inside, the hall buzzed with activity. Young pianists with confident postures stood in small groups, chatting in multiple languages. Many were accompanied by severe-looking teachers who scrutinized the posted schedules with narrowed eyes. Akiko approached the registration desk, giving her name in a voice that came out smaller than she intended. "Yamamoto." The woman behind the desk checked her list. "Ah, yes. The late edition." She handed Akiko a packet of information and a badge. "Preliminary round tomorrow, 2:15 p.m. You're the third performer in the afternoon session." As they turned away from the desk, Akiko nearly collided with a tall boy about her age. He wore an expensive-looking suit and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had been on stage all his life. "Sorry," Akiko murmured, stepping back. The boy glanced at her badge. "You're the replacement for Kojima." His tone wasn't unkind, just curious. "Where do you study?" I have a teacher in Kyoto, but I don't attend a music school," Akiko admitted. Something like surprise flickered across his face. "Really? That's unusual for this competition." He extended his hand. "I'm Takeshi, Tokyo Conservatory." Akiko shook his hand, noting the calluses on his fingertips that matched her own. Akiko. "Well, good luck tomorrow, Akiko from Kyoto," he said with a small smile before rejoining a group of other young pianists. That afternoon, they were allowed to practice in the small rehearsal rooms. Akiko waited until several other contestants had signed up before timidly adding her name to the schedule. The room contained a gleaming grand piano, far superior to anything she had ever played. She approached it almost reverently, running her fingers lightly over the polished surface before sitting down. The touch was different from what she was used to, more responsive, with a depth of sound that her digital keyboard couldn't replicate. She would need to adjust her playing, especially the pedaling, which created much more resonance here than on her instrument at home. For 2 hours, she worked on adapting to the new piano, focusing particularly on the difficult passages of the ballade. Through the walls, she could hear other contestants practicing, flawless scales, thundering octaves, dazzling technical displays that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. That night, she barely slept. Mrs. Tanaka had prepared a comfortable guest futon, but Akiko lay awake, her mind racing through the pieces, imagining all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. What if she forgot the music? What if her hands froze? What if everyone laughed at the girl from Kyoto, who dared to think she belonged in this competition? Morning came too quickly. Akiko picked at her breakfast while Mrs. Tanaka chattered nervously and her mother watched with worried eyes. "Eat," her mother finally said. "You need strength today." The morning session of the preliminaries was already underway when they arrived at Suntory Hall. Akiko and her mother slipped into the back of the auditorium to listen to some of the other performers. The standard was intimidatingly high. One girl around Akiko's age played a Chopin scherzo with such technical precision that it seemed impossible her fingers could move so quickly. "She's been playing since she was 3, whispered a woman in front of them to her companion. "Studies with Professor Watanabe." As the morning progressed, Akiko's anxiety grew. These weren't just good pianists. They were polished performers with years of elite training. During the lunch break, she couldn't eat the sandwich her mother had packed. Instead, she found an empty corridor and paced, her hands moving through the motions of playing, trying to calm her racing heart. "Nervous?" a voice asked. It was Takeshi, the boy from yesterday. Akiko nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Everyone is," he said, leaning against the wall. "I've done 17 competitions and I still feel sick before each one." 17? Akiko couldn't hide her surprise. "Since I was 8, he confirmed. "This is my 3rd time at this particular competition. Did you win before?" "3rd place last year," he said with a small grimace. "My teacher was disappointed." The casual way he mentioned this accomplishment and its apparent inadequacy made Akiko feel even more out of place. What was she doing here, competing against people who had dedicated their entire lives to this pursuit? As if reading her thoughts, Takeshi added, "But I watched your video. The ballade. It was different." Before she could ask what he meant, an announcement called the afternoon performers to prepare. Akiko hurried to the waiting area, where 6 young pianists sat in uncomfortable silence, each lost in their own world of nerves and mental preparation. The first 2 performers played beautifully, their fingers flying over the keys with accuracy and poise. All too soon, a staff member approached Akiko. "You're next, Miss Yamamoto. Please follow me." The walk to the stage felt eternal. The competition hall wasn't full. Preliminary rounds rarely attracted large audiences, but there were perhaps 100 people scattered through the seats, including the panel of 5 judges seated at a long table near the front. Akiko's mother sat near the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The gleaming concert grand piano waited center stage, its lid fully open, much larger than the rehearsal instrument. Akiko's legs felt weak as she approached it, bowing slightly to the audience and judges before taking her seat. The stage lights were bright, making it difficult to see the audience clearly. Akiko adjusted the bench, her hands trembling slightly. She placed her fingers on the keys and took 3 deep breaths, a ritual her first teacher had taught her years ago. She began with the nocturne in B-flat minor, a piece that starts softly, almost hesitantly. The first few notes were shaky, her fingers not quite cooperating. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself. Then something shifted. Perhaps it was the piano itself, with its rich singing tone that seemed to respond to her touch in a way her keyboard at home never could. Perhaps it was the acoustics of the hall which carried the sound up into the rafters and back again. Or perhaps it was simply that in this moment of truth the music itself came to her rescue. The melody flowed from her fingers, a sad, gentle song that floated above the hushed audience. As she continued playing, the world outside the piano began to fade away. The judges, the competitors, even her own anxiety, all receded until there was only Chopin's voice speaking through her hands. The nocturne ended, and without pausing for the customary moment between pieces, Akiko moved directly into the Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The opening bars posed their haunting question to the silent hall. Then came the main theme, which Akiko played not as a technical exercise but as a story unfolding. The story of a young girl finding her voice through music, of a family's sacrifices, of dreams that seemed impossible until suddenly they weren't. As the piece built toward its dramatic conclusion, Akiko's body swayed slightly with the music's pull. Her technique wasn't flawless. There were smudged notes in the most difficult passages, but there was something in her playing that made such imperfections irrelevant. She had forgotten about the competition, the judges, her own limitations. She was having a conversation with Chopin himself, across centuries and cultures, 2 souls speaking the same wordless language. The final chords thundered through the hall, and Akiko's hands at last lifted from the keys. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then the applause began, not the polite, measured applause that had followed other performers, but something more spontaneous and genuine. As she stood and bowed, slightly dizzy from the intensity of the experience, Akiko caught sight of one of the judges leaning over to whisper to another. The woman's face showed an expression Akiko couldn't quite interpret, surprise perhaps, or even confusion. In the waiting area, her mother embraced her with tears in her eyes. "You played beautifully," she whispered. "I made mistakes," Akiko said, suddenly remembering all the technical flaws in her performance. "No one was listening for mistakes," her mother replied. That evening, they gathered around the Tanaka's computer to check the results, which would be posted online. 24 pianists had performed in the preliminaries. Only 12 would advance to the semifinals. Mrs. Tanaka refreshed the page repeatedly until the list appeared. They scanned for Akiko's name, moving down the list with increasing disappointment. Then, at the very bottom, Yamamoto, Akiko, advancing to semifinals. She had made it, just barely. But she had made it. The phone rang minutes later. It was Mr. Nakamura, the competition director, who had invited her. "Miss Yamamoto," he said when Akiko's mother passed her the phone, "the judges asked me to call you personally. They were quite moved by your performance today." "Thank you," Akiko said, unsure what else to say. One of them described it as watching someone have a conversation with Chopin himself. "They would like you to know that while your ranking is 12th, there was considerable debate about placing you higher. Your technical execution had flaws, but your musical understanding—" He paused. "Well, it was exceptional. They look forward to your semifinal performance." That night, as Akiko finally drifted toward sleep, she realized something had changed within her. She had stepped onto that stage as a girl playing at being a concert pianist. She had walked off as a musician, regardless of what happened next. Morning light filtered through the curtains as Akiko opened her eyes. For a moment she forgot where she was, the unfamiliar ceiling of the Tanaka's guest room confusing her. Then it all came rushing back. The competition, her performance yesterday, the surprising news that she had advanced to the semifinals. She reached for her phone and found several messages waiting. Her father, who rarely texted, had written simply, "We are proud of you." Her piano teacher back in Kyoto had sent a longer message, full of exclamation points and advice for the semifinals. And there was one from her cousin Haruki. "You're trending on music forums again. They're calling you the Kyoto piano girl." This last message made her stomach tighten. She set the phone down without replying and went to find her mother, who was already in the kitchen with Mrs. Tanaka, both women drinking tea and speaking in low voices that stopped when Akiko entered. "Good morning," her mother said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," Akiko lied. In truth, she had tossed and turned, replaying every mistake from her performance and imagining all the ways she could fail in the semifinals. "Is everything okay?" The two women exchanged glances. "Your performance yesterday," Mrs. Tanaka began. "Someone recorded it," her mother finished. "It's online." Akiko felt her cheeks grow hot. "But that's against the competition rules." "Apparently it was taken on a phone from the audience," Mrs. Tanaka explained, turning her tablet around to show Akiko. "It's not professional quality," but on the video showed Akiko at the piano, filmed from an angle that caught her profile and her hands. The sound was surprisingly clear. As she watched herself sway slightly with the music, lost in Chopin's world, Akiko felt a strange disconnection. Was that really her? The comment section beneath the video was filled with reactions. "Who is this girl? Where did she come from? Not technically perfect, but I can't stop listening. This is what Chopin should sound like, straight from the heart. I've heard professionals play this piece for 30 years and never been moved like this." "There are already over 15,000 views," Mrs. Tanaka said. Looking both impressed and concerned, Akiko pushed the tablet away, suddenly not hungry for the breakfast Mrs. Tanaka had prepared. "I need to practice," she said quietly. The semifinals were 2 days away. Unlike the preliminaries, which had required solo pieces, the semifinal round included both a solo work and, for those who advanced to the finals, a movement from a concerto with piano accompaniment standing in for the orchestra. For the next 2 days, Akiko practiced relentlessly. The Tanaka's apartment became her sanctuary as the outside world grew increasingly interested in the Kyoto piano girl. Her mother fielded calls from local newspapers and even a television station, politely declining all interview requests. "You need to focus on the competition," she told Akiko. There will be time for everything else later. On the morning of the semi-finals, Akiko arrived at Suntory Hall to find a larger crowd than before. As she made her way to the rehearsal rooms, she noticed people watching her, whispering behind their hands. One young girl even approached for an autograph before being pulled away by an embarrassed parent. "You've become quite the celebrity," a familiar voice said. Takeshi stood by the practice room sign-up sheet, looking amused. "Not by choice," Akiko replied, uncomfortable with the attention. "Well, you've certainly made this competition more interesting." He seemed about to say more when a stern-looking older man called his name. "My teacher," he explained, rolling his eyes slightly. "Good luck today. I'm performing right after you." The semi-final performances had a different energy than the preliminaries. The audience was larger, the atmosphere more charged. Backstage, the 6 remaining female contestants and 6 males waited in separate rooms, each lost in their own preparation rituals. Akiko sat alone in a corner, eyes closed, mentally playing through her pieces one last time. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage with her head slightly higher than before. The bright light still made it difficult to see the audience clearly, but she could sense the anticipation in the hall. For the semi-final round, she would play Chopin's Nocturne in C minor, followed by the first movement of the Piano Concerto No. 1 in E minor, with Professor Kato from the competition staff playing the orchestral reduction on a second piano. She began the Nocturne, allowing its melancholy beauty to flow through her fingers. Unlike the preliminary round, where nerves had initially made her playing tentative, today she felt a strange calmness. The thousands of hours she had spent with Chopin's music, in her family's apartment, in the empty apartment the building manager let her use, on the Tanaka's old upright, had prepared her for this moment. The Nocturne ended, and after a brief pause to center herself, she nodded to Professor Kato. The concerto began with the orchestral introduction, played on the second piano. When it came time for Akiko's entrance, she took a deep breath and launched into the sweeping main theme. Playing with another pianist was new territory for Akiko. In Kyoto, she had practiced the concerto alone, imagining the orchestral parts. Now she had to listen and respond, adjusting her tempo and expression to match Professor Kato's accompaniment. It was like having a musical conversation, challenging but exhilarating. As the movement progressed to its climactic sections, Akiko felt something remarkable happening. The boundary between herself and the music was dissolving. Her hands seemed to know exactly where to go, her body how to express each phrase. Even the more technically demanding passages, the runs, the trills, the rapid chord changes flowed naturally. The final chords resonated through the hall, and Akiko released the pedal, letting the sound fade to silence. For a moment no one moved. Then the applause began, growing into something that felt like a physical force washing over her. As she stood to bow, she noticed something she hadn't before. People were standing. Not everyone, but pockets of audience members throughout the hall had risen to their feet. Backstage, her mother waited with tears streaming down her face. "Akiko," she whispered, embracing her daughter tightly. Professor Kato, who had accompanied her, stopped by briefly. "You have a gift," he said simply before continuing to prepare for the next performer. Takeshi passed her on his way to the stage, giving her a quick thumbs up. "You've set the bar impossibly high," he muttered, but his smile seemed genuine. The results would not be announced until all 12 semi-finalists had performed. Akiko and her mother sat in the audience, listening to the remaining pianists. All were excellent, their technique often more polished than Akiko's. Yet she noticed something interesting. After her performance, the atmosphere in the hall had changed. The audience seemed to be listening differently, seeking not just technical brilliance but emotional connection. Late that evening, the finalists were announced. Only 6 would continue, 3 women and 3 men. Akiko held her mother's hand tightly as the names were called, not daring to hope yet unable to stop herself. And advancing to the final round, the competition director announced, Yamamoto Akiko. This time she was not last on the list but third, a significant jump from her preliminary ranking. As they left the hall, a small group of reporters waited outside. Camera flashes startled Akiko, and questions came from all directions. "Miss Yamamoto, how does it feel to advance to the finals? Is it true you have no formal conservatory training? How long have you been playing Chopin? Her mother stepped in front of her protectively. No questions, please. My daughter needs to rest. They pushed through the crowd to where Mrs. Tanaka waited in her car. As they drove away, Akiko caught sight of herself in the side mirror. She looked the same as always, yet somehow different. There was a clarity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Back at the apartment, they found Mr. Tanaka watching something on his computer. When they entered, he quickly stood up. "You're all over the internet," he said, turning the screen toward them. Not only had another audience member uploaded her semifinal performance, but music blogs and websites had picked up the story of the Kyoto piano girl. One headline read, "Unknown teenager delivers most moving Chopin interpretation in decades." "There's more," Mr. Tanaka said, scrolling down to show them. "Your preliminary performance video has now been viewed over 50,000 times. Akiko sank into a chair, overwhelmed. 3 weeks ago, she had been practicing in an empty apartment in Kyoto, playing for herself and occasionally her parents. Now strangers around Japan and increasingly around the world were watching her play. "What does this mean?" she asked her mother, her voice small. Mrs. Yamamoto sat beside her, taking her hand. "It means people connect with your music, just as we always have. But nothing has to change if you don't want it to." That night, Akiko's father called. His voice, usually so reserved, trembled slightly. "I watched the live stream at work," he admitted. "My colleagues gathered around my computer. They were all cheering for you." "I'm scared, Dad," Akiko whispered, admitting what she couldn't say to her mother. "What if I can't play as well in the finals? What if everyone is disappointed?" There was a pause before her father spoke. "Akiko, do you remember why you started playing piano?" She thought back to that rainy day in elementary school, to the first time she'd touched the keys of the donated piano. "Because it made me happy." "Then play for that reason," her father said simply. "Not for the judges or the audience or the internet. Just play for the joy of it, as you always have." After they hung up, Akiko went to the Tanaka's piano. It was late, but they had told her she could practice any time. Instead of working on the concerto for the finals, she played a simple folk song, the very first piece she had learned on that old-school piano 8 years ago. As the familiar melody filled the quiet apartment, Akiko felt her anxiety begin to ease. Whatever happened in the finals, whatever came after, the music itself would remain her constant companion. That knowledge gave her a sense of peace as she prepared to face whatever the final round would bring. The morning of the final round dawned clear and bright. Akiko woke early, her mind already alert despite having slept only a few hours. Today would be different from the previous rounds. The finals would be held in the main concert hall with the Tokyo Philharmonic Orchestra, and each finalist would perform a complete concerto. For Akiko, that meant all 3 movements of Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1 in E minor, nearly 40 minutes of music that would test not just her technique but her physical and mental endurance. She dressed carefully in the navy blue dress her mother had made, which now seemed to carry the weight of their family's hopes and sacrifices. As Mrs. Tanaka drove them to Suntory Hall, the car radio played a classical music station where the announcer was discussing the competition. "And the surprise story this year is 17-year-old Akiko Yamamoto from Kyoto," the voice said. With no formal conservatory training, she has captivated audiences with her deeply personal interpretations of Chopin. Many are calling her the discovery of the year. Mrs. Tanaka quickly changed the station, catching Akiko's eye in the rearview mirror with an apologetic smile. The scene at Suntory Hall was unlike anything Akiko had experienced before. Television cameras were set up in the lobby. People she didn't recognize nodded or waved as if they knew her. A group of high school students asked to take photos with her, explaining that their music teacher had shown them Akiko's videos as an example of playing from the heart. Backstage was equally chaotic. The 6 finalists would each have a brief rehearsal with the orchestra before the evening performance. Akiko's was scheduled last, which meant hours of waiting and trying to stay calm while listening to the other pianists work with the conductor. When her turn finally came, she walked onto the stage feeling oddly small in the vast space. The members of the Tokyo Philharmonic, one of Japan's most prestigious orchestras, watched her with curious expressions. Some smiled encouragingly. Others looked skeptical of this unknown teenager who had somehow reached the finals. The conductor, Maestro Kobayashi, greeted her warmly. "Miss Yamamoto, it's a pleasure. We'll run through the major transitions and the opening of each movement to get comfortable with tempos. Ready? The rehearsal was brief but reassuring. The orchestra was responsive, and Maestro Kobayashi seemed genuinely interested in Akiko's interpretation rather than trying to impose his own ideas. "You understand Chopin very naturally," he told her, after they finished the final movement. "Trust that understanding tonight." There were hours still before the evening performance. Akiko's mother took her to a small cafe far enough from the concert hall to avoid running into anyone connected with the competition. "You need to eat," she insisted, ordering soup and sandwiches even though Akiko claimed she wasn't hungry. As they sat in the quiet corner of the cafe, Akiko's phone buzzed with a video call. It was her father calling from Kyoto. "I took the afternoon off," he explained, his face unusually animated. "I'm going to your grandmother's to watch the broadcast with her." "You didn't need to do that," Akiko said, touched by this rare break in her father's rigid work routine. "Of course I did." He paused, then added softly, "Your mother tells me you're nervous." Akiko nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good," her father said, surprising her. "Nerves mean you care. Just don't let them take over." His face moved closer to the camera as if sharing a secret. "I get nervous too before big presentations at work." "Do you know what I do?" Akiko shook her head. "I think about your mother and you and why I'm doing the work in the first place. Then the nerves become useful." It was perhaps the most personal conversation she'd ever had with her father, who typically expressed his affection through actions rather than words. As they said goodbye, Akiko felt a new kind of strength flowing into her. Back at Suntory Hall, the atmosphere had transformed for the evening performance. The hall was full with nearly 2,000 people in attendance. Behind the scenes, stagehands and camera operators moved with practiced efficiency. Each finalist had been assigned a small green room where they could prepare in private. In hers, Akiko sat alone, her eyes closed, mentally playing through the concerto. She had memorized every note, every dynamic marking, every subtle shift in tempo. Now she reminded herself of what mattered most, not perfection, but connection. Connection with Chopin, with the orchestra, with the audience, and with her own love for the music. A gentle knock at the door signaled it was time. Akiko was to perform fourth, which meant a long wait in the wings, listening as her competitors each delivered impressive performances with the orchestra. Takeshi, who performed just before her, played Chopin's other concerto brilliantly, drawing enthusiastic applause. As he exited the stage, he passed Akiko waiting in the wings. "Good luck," he whispered, surprising her with a quick, encouraging squeeze of her hand. Then her name was announced. The walk to the center of the stage felt like a dream. The concert hall stretched before her, larger than she had imagined, filled with faces that blurred together in the stage lights. The glossy black grand piano waited, its lid raised high, reflecting the overhead lights. Behind it, the orchestra members sat at attention, their instruments ready. Maestro Kobayashi extended his hand to her as she approached, a gesture of respect between fellow musicians rather than adult to teenager. Akiko bowed to him, to the orchestra, and then to the audience before taking her seat at the piano. A moment of complete silence filled the hall as everyone waited for the first notes. Akiko placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and nodded to the conductor. The orchestra began the extended introduction to the concerto, building the musical landscape that the piano would soon enter. Akiko listened intently, feeling the music flow around her. When the moment came for her entrance, she joined the sonic tapestry with confidence, her fingers finding the keys as naturally as breathing. The first movement unfolded like a conversation between friends, the piano and orchestra exchanging ideas, supporting and challenging each other. In the cadenza, the extended solo passage near the end of the movement, Akiko felt a freedom she hadn't expected, as if the thousands of hours of practice had created a space where spontaneity could flourish within the framework of Chopin's composition. As the second movement began with its nocturne-like intimacy, Akiko noticed a change in the atmosphere of the hall. The audience seemed to lean forward collectively, drawn into the quieter, more personal world Chopin had created. This had always been her favorite part of the concerto, where the piano sings a love song of extraordinary tenderness. She allowed herself to be completely vulnerable in these passages, playing as if sharing her innermost feelings. The transition to the third movement brought a return to energy and brilliance. Here Chopin had written music that danced and sparkled, full of the Polish folk rhythms he loved. Akiko's fingers flew across the keys, her body moving with the music's pulse. She was no longer playing notes on a page. She was telling a story, one that had begun in her small Kyoto apartment and had somehow brought her to this magnificent stage. As the concerto raced toward its conclusion, Akiko felt a surge of joy unlike anything she had experienced before. The final chords rang out triumphantly. The orchestra and piano united in a glorious affirmation. For a moment after the last note, Akiko remained perfectly still, her hands hovering above the keys, reluctant to break the spell. Then the applause began, hesitant at first, then building into a wave that washed over her. As she stood and turned to acknowledge the orchestra, she saw the musicians themselves were applauding, some tapping their bows against their music stands in a musician's gesture of special appreciation. Maestro Kobayashi was beaming as he motioned for her to take a bow. The audience rose to their feet, section by section, until the entire hall was standing. Akiko bowed several times, overwhelmed by the response. As she finally left the stage, she found her mother waiting in the wings, tears streaming down her face. "They loved you," she whispered, embracing her daughter. The remaining two finalists performed well, but there was a sense that something special had already happened that evening. When all six had finished, they gathered on stage for the announcement of the results, which would be determined by the judges' scores combined with a small percentage allocated to audience voting. The third-place winner was a young man from Osaka. Second place went to Takeshi, who accepted with a gracious bow. Then a hush fell over the hall as the announcer prepared to name the winner. "First prize in this year's Tokyo piano competition," he said, "goes to Akiko Yamamoto." The hall erupted in cheers. Akiko stood frozen until Takeshi gently nudged her forward to accept the crystal trophy and the envelope containing a scholarship to study at any music school of her choice. The next hours passed in a blur of congratulations, photographs, and interviews. By the time they returned to the Tanaka's apartment, it was well past midnight. Mr. Tanaka greeted them with the news that Akiko's final performance video had already been viewed over 100,000 times and was climbing rapidly. "Your phone has been ringing constantly," he added, handing it to her. "There are messages from record labels, concert venues, music festivals." Akiko set the phone aside without checking the messages. Instead, she called her father, who answered immediately despite the late hour. "Grandmother cried through your whole performance," he said before she could speak. "So did I, if I'm honest." "I won, Dad," she said simply, too tired for more words. "We know," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "The whole neighborhood knows. Someone set up a projector in the community center and everyone watched together. They're calling you Kyoto's daughter now." The next morning, Akiko's mother found her at the Tanaka's piano, playing not Chopin but a simple piece she had composed herself years ago. "What happens now?" Akiko asked, looking up at her mother. "Everything's changing so fast." Mrs. Yamamoto sat beside her on the bench. "Only what you want to change," she said. "The competition offered you choices, not obligations." In the days that followed, those choices became clearer. The scholarship would allow Akiko to study at Tokyo's prestigious music academy without financial burden on her family. A small record label specializing in classical music offered her the chance to record an album of Chopin's works. And there were invitations to perform, not a grueling international tour, but select concerts where she could continue to develop as an artist. 2 weeks after the competition, Akiko returned to Kyoto with her mother. Their apartment seemed smaller than she remembered, yet somehow more precious. Her digital keyboard waited in its usual corner, looking humble after the magnificent grand piano she had played in Tokyo. She sat down and played a few notes, feeling the familiar resistance of the keys. On her computer screen, a notification showed that her competition performances had now been viewed more than 200,000 times. People from around the world had left comments about how her playing had moved them, how it had helped them understand classical music in a new way, how it had brought them to tears or given them comfort. Akiko closed the computer and turned back to her keyboard. Fame was strange and a little frightening, but the music itself remained unchanged. Whether she played for hundreds of thousands of online viewers or just for herself in this quiet room, the conversation between her heart and Chopin's would continue, honest, intimate, and real. Outside, the Kyoto evening settled softly around their building. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, decisions about school, about recording, about the future that had suddenly opened wide before her. But tonight, Akiko played for the same reason she had first touched a piano keys 8 years ago, for the simple joy of bringing music into the world.